But from my own experience, I grew up in a relatively diverse culture. Some of my very closest friends are not white. My best man in my wedding was black. Um, and I sit on my porch and I play Johnny Cash. I Many of my, not all exclusively, but many of my favorite musicians, white as you could possibly imagine. I mean, Johnny Cash is a great example. But I don't feel the need then to go a step further and say, in order to preserve these important pieces of white culture that have been important to me, I need to exclude another race of people in order for that to be a distinct feature of my identity. Um, so, why do we need then to put up the walls, the defenses? And then I guess I want to ask kind of a follow up too. Do you think that you understand the apprehensions that Americans have when they hear something like whites only? Because it wasn't. We're not talking hundreds and hundreds of years ago. It's just a few decades ago that white people, that black folks were excluded from public education system. They were excluded from public transit. They were excluded from voting. They were excluded from um, the public square. Period. They had no social power. They were excluded from access to any sort of means that they might acquire a modicum of wealth. And so, do you understand their apprehensions if they hear whites only? It kind of feels to them like maybe we are we made some progress, and now we're going to turn back the clock, and before you know it, it's just one law, it's two laws, it's and then now we've undone the Civil Rights Act completely, and black people's freedoms have been stripped. Does that is that an argument that makes sense to you, that they're apprehensive about that, concerned about that?
It's a slippery slope argument, basically. And I think sometimes those are legitimate arguments. In this case, what I believe happened was that we had forced legal segregation, and that was wrong. And then we swung to the opposite extreme, where now we have a legal regime that in many cases forces racial integration, forced busing to make the schools, socially engineering the schools to be more diverse than they otherwise would be. Not because that's the will of the parents, but because that's the will of the people running our government. And I think that's wrong. I think forced racial integration is unethical. I think forced racial segregation is unethical. But we don't see the problem with the ethics of the government enforcing this regime because most of us were raised in the public education system where that ethos, that morality is indoctrinated into us from a very early age. We're taught about the evils of Jim Crow, not in this neutral way where we read the source documents and really get inside, or with the Civil War, get inside the perspective of the Confederates. No, we're listening to still basically Civil War propaganda from the side that won, and the winners write the history. We learn about Jim Crow and segregation from the side of the winners of that cultural conflict. And it's a very biased perspective that the vast majority of people have gotten. Most of the media is heavily left biased. So there has been a program intentionally on the part of ideological leftists, in many cases communists, to break down our traditional sense of identity. This is part of cultural Marxism, right? That school of thought where, communism will be possible if we break down traditional values and make a new man. And then that new man will be receptive to this new way of organizing. That's the socialist communist agenda. And there are true communists, like many college professors identify as communists. So it's not like all this stuff is just happening because of historical inertia. It's not like, well, the right side just won out because there's been moral progress. No, interested actors have pushed our country intentionally in a certain direction that is antithetically opposed to preserving our traditional identity and values. And I think that's wrong. So that's why things swung the other way, and now we do have de facto forced racial integration in many domains of life. So I think that's a slippery slope too. Okay, so we're not allowed to choose our neighbors. We're not allowed to choose who we work with. At some point in time, will I even get to have the nuclear family? There are social theorists who write that we should break down the nuclear family and basically children should belong to the state. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to see that. There's also a slippery slope in that direction. Instead of going to the two vicious means of forced segregation or forced integration, we should go for the golden mean, virtuous position of allowing people to associate freely how they want and to preserve those identities that they value. So why do I think, though, it's necessary to be explicit about that? Why would I stand up for that? Because it's been inexplicit only for white Americans or Europeans more generally now. Like, no European ethnicity, is recognized as an indigenous people group besides the Sami. But like, where do you think the English are indigenous to then? The answer is, according to the UN, according to these international organizations, nowhere. We have no homelands for white peoples. And we're the only people that applies to. We accept that Nigerians have a homeland. It's Nigeria. Liberia, I'm pretty sure you have to be black to even be a citizen there. And there are other ethno-nationalist projects around the world. In Israel, they're a Jewish state for the Jewish people, not just the Jewish religion, but for their Jewish people. They think to preserve their culture, they should have a government that represents them. I'm not even asking for that, and that's excluding all sorts of people on the basis of their racial, ethnic identity. I think you need to draw that line and say, yes, we're a real thing, because if you don't have a clear line around who you are, well, then other people will push into that space and try to tell you who you are. If you don't define yourself, other people will define you. And that's what's happened to white Americans. And what's the end result of that after decades? We're not recognized as a legitimate people. And even though demographically we're becoming a minority, and Europeans in Europe are on track to be minorities in their own homelands by the end of the century, despite that, we're still not a legitimate people with any legitimate interests. We have no, white caucus representing us in Congress. There's a congressional black caucus. There are Jewish lobbying groups. No one is defending the interests of white Americans. And so that's why it has to be explicit.